I paid $7 for an old jewelry box at an estate sale, and I almost left it behind. It was a Saturday morning in late October, one of those gray, damp days where the sky can't decide whether to rain or just stay miserable. My neighbor Paulette had texted me the night before about an estate sale 2 blocks over. The kind where a whole life gets priced and tagged and spread out across folding tables. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed to get out of the house. The sale was at a cream-colored colonial on Birchwood Drive. The family had already set everything up by the time I arrived: dishes, lamps, a rocking chair with a cracked leg, boxes of paperback novels with sun-faded spines. The kind of things that accumulate over 60 or 70 years of living. I walked through slowly, the way you do at these places, half browsing, half paying your respects. The jewelry box was on a folding table near the back of the living room, tucked between a ceramic rooster and a stack of Reader's Digest issues from the 90s. It was dark walnut, about the size of a shoebox, with a small brass clasp that had gone green at the edges. The velvet lining inside was a deep burgundy, worn thin in sps, and there was a little ballerina that no longer spun because the mechanism had given out. On the price sticker, someone had written 7 black marker. I almost put it back. I don't even wear much jewelry. But something about the weight of it felt right in my hands, solid, like it had been made to last. And honestly, $7. I paid and carried it to my car without thinking much more about it. I set it on my kitchen counter when I got home, wiped the dust off the top with a damp cloth, and opened the lid. Inside was nothing. A few scattered costume earrings, a broken bracelet, a button that had no business being in a jewelry box. I cleared those out and was about to set it on the shelf in my bedroom when I noticed something. The bottom of the box felt wrong. I mean that in the most literal sense. I was running my fingers along the velvet lining to smooth it out, and the base didn't give the way velvet over wood should. It felt layered, like there was something beneath it. I pressed down in the center, and there was the faintest give, the kind you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. I got a butter knife from the drawer and slid it carefully along the edge of the velvet. It lifted, not all of it, just the bottom panel, which turned out to be a thin piece of plywood cut to fit perfectly inside the box. Underneath it was a shallow compartment, maybe half an inch deep. Inside that compartment were 2 things. The first was a small manila envelope, sealed with no name on the outside. The second was a folded piece of paper, handwritten, that began with the words, "If you're reading this, then I've already gone," and the box ended up where I hoped it would. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, not moving. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. I looked at the envelope, then at the letter, then at the envelope again. I sat down at the kitchen table and I read. The letter was written by a woman named Agnes Whitmore. Her handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind you learn in school before everything moved to keyboards. Each letter formed with intention, slightly slanted to the right. She'd written it on ivory stationery that had gone slightly yellow at the edges. She explained who she was in the first paragraph, the way someone writes when they're not sure who will be reading. Agnes Whitmore, age 79, retired schoolteacher, 41 years at Fairview Elementary in Clarksville, Tennessee, before she and her husband Raymond moved north to be closer to their daughter after Raymond's first stroke. That daughter was named Lynette. Agnes wrote about Raymond first, how he'd passed 4 years earlier, quietly, in the recliner he refused to give up even after the upholstery started to crack. She wrote about it without self-pity, the way people do when grief has had enough time to settle into something they can carry. She missed him, she said, every single day. But that wasn't what the letter was about. The letter was about Lynette Hargrove, her daughter, married name Hargrove, 47 years old, living 12 minutes away in a house that Agnes had helped them buy when they were first starting out. I want to be careful how I describe what Agnes wrote about Lynette because I only have one side of the story. But I'll tell you what she said because it matters for everything that came after. Agnes, that for the last several years of her life, she had been afraid of her own daughter. Not physically, she clarified. Lynette had never raised a hand to her, but there was a slow, steady kind of pressure that Agnes described in the letter. Decisions made for her without her input. Money that Agnes had set aside for specific things quietly redirected toward Lynette's household, a pattern of being talked out of her own preferences until Agnes couldn't always remember what her preferences had been. When Raymond was alive, it was less noticeable. After he passed, it became the water Agnes lived in. She'd tried talking to her son-in-law, a man named Kurt Hargrove, but Kurt did whatever Lynette wanted. She'd tried talking to her church pastor, but he'd suggested prayer and family mediation, which went nowhere. She'd tried talking to her doctor, but she didn't know how to say what she needed to say in a 15-minute appointment. So Agnes started quietly setting things aside, not a lot at once. She was careful about that. Over several years, whenever she sold something, a piece of furniture, Raymond's tools, her wedding china, she'd pocket some of the cash rather than put it in the joint account she shared access to with Lynette. She kept it in different places at first, then decided the jewelry box was safest. The bottom panel had been Raymond's idea. Actually, he'd built it himself decades earlier as a hiding place for the spare house key, then forgotten about it entirely. Agnes had not forgotten. By the time she wrote the letter, the compartment held a savings bond in her name and Lynette's name, but with a handwritten addendum that Agnes had had notarized, which stated that in the event of Agnes's death, the bond was to pass not to Lynette, but to whoever presented the notarized letter and the bond together to the issuing bank. Her attorney, a man named Sheldon Marquette, had advised against it, but Agnes had insisted, and he'd helped her structure it as best he could within what was legally possible. The savings bond was in the manila envelope. It was worth $42,000. Agnes ended the letter with 2 sentences that I have thought about almost every day since. I know this is an unusual way to do things, but I needed someone I didn't know to find it, someone who had no reason to take it from me. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. I want to tell you that I immediately knew what to do. That would make for a cleaner story. But the truth is, I sat there with that letter in my hands for probably 20 minutes, just breathing. My coffee went cold. I read the letter 3 times. The first thing I felt was something like vertigo. The specific dizziness of realizing that an ordinary Saturday morning has turned into something you are completely unprepared for. The second thing I felt was an ache for Agnes Whitmore, a woman I had never met, who had spent years carefully, quietly planning how to protect something that was hers from someone who was supposed to love her. I didn't open the manila envelope that day. I set it back in the compartment, replaced the panel, closed the box, and put it on the high shelf in my closet. Then I called my friend Judith Carmichael, who used to work in estate law before she moved into real estate, and I told her everything. Judith was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't touch the envelope. Don't tell anyone you have it, and call an attorney tomorrow morning first thing." I did exactly that. The attorney was a woman named Sandra Pruitt, whom Judith recommended. I went to her office on Monday morning with the jewelry box under my arm and the letter in a Ziploc bag because I'd read enough crime shows to know you're not supposed to handle documents more than necessary. Sandra Pruitt was in her early 50s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the kind of calm that comes from having seen a lot of people in difficult situations. She read the letter twice, examined the envelope without opening it, and sat back in her chair. "Tell me where you got the box," she said. I told her everything: the estate sale, the price tag, the drive home, the velvet lining. "Do you know who organized the sale?" she asked. I didn't, but I had the address. Sandra made a note. "Here's the situation," she said. "A savings bond is a negotiable instrument. The notarized addendum Agnes had prepared creates a specific conditional transfer, but it's unusual and its enforceability depends on a few things. How it was notarized, whether it meets the requirements for a valid testamentary document, whether Agnes's estate has already been probated." She paused. "What I'd like to do is research Agnes Whitmore first, find out if she's passed, when, and what happened with her estate. Then we'll know what we're dealing with." She called me 4 days later. Agnes Whitmore had passed away 11 months earlier, in November, at a care facility in Milford County. She had been moved there 6 months before her death, after what her family described as a decline in her ability to manage daily tasks. Her estate had been probated and closed. Lynette Hargrove had been the sole beneficiary. There was no mention of the jewelry box in the estate inventory, which meant either the box had been overlooked, possible, given how small and unremarkable it was, or Lynette had not known about the hidden compartment. Given everything Agnes had written, I suspected the latter. Agnes had been careful for a reason. Sandra said there was a credible legal argument to be made for honoring the notarized addendum as a valid holographic codicil, a handwritten addition to a will, particularly since it had been notarized, which added weight to Agnes's intent. It wasn't airtight. There were counter-arguments, but it wasn't nothing. "What I'd recommend," Sandra said, "is that we contact the estate attorney who handled Agnes's probate and disclose the existence of the bond and the letter. Let the process work. If the codicil holds, the transfer may be validated. If it doesn't, the bond technically becomes part of the estate, which is already closed and distributed to Lynette." She paused again. "But the fact that it was notarized matters. Agnes knew what she was doing. I asked her what my chances were. She smiled carefully. Better than you might think. I won't pretend the next several weeks were easy. There were phone calls I dreaded making, documents I had to request, and a lot of time spent sitting in my car in parking lots afterward, just breathing. Sandra handled most of the legal communication, which I was grateful for. I gave her Agnes's letter, the jewelry box, the bond, and everything I could remember about the estate sale. It was during the 3rd week that Lynette Hargrove called me. I don't know how she got my number. Sandra said she'd reached out to the estate attorney, who had presumably passed the information along. Whatever the chain, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening, and the name on the screen was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Is this the woman who bought my mother's jewelry box?" Her voice was controlled, careful, the kind of careful that takes practice. "Yes," I said. "My name is Lynette Hargrove. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." I'd thought about this conversation. Sandra had actually coached me a little. Stay calm. Don't engage on the substance. Refer everything to your attorney. But here's the thing about planning for a difficult conversation. The actual conversation is always different from the one you practiced. I said, "I've been working with an attorney. She can answer any questions you have." There was a pause. "My mother was not well at the end of her life," Lynette said. "She wasn't making good decisions. Whatever she wrote, whatever she thought she was doing, she wasn't in a position to make those kinds of arrangements." Something shifted in my chest. I thought about Agnes's letter. The careful handwriting, the decades at Fairview Elementary, the way she'd written about Raymond, clearly, precisely, with grief and affection and not a trace of confusion. I thought about the word notarized and what it takes to get something notarized. You have to appear in person, present identification, sign in front of a witness. "I understand you have concerns," I said. "Please contact Sandra Pruitt at Pruitt Family Law. She'll be glad to speak with you." Lynette said something else that I didn't quite catch because my hands had started shaking. I repeated Sandra's name and number, and I ended the call. I sat on my kitchen floor for a little while after that, not because I was defeated, I wasn't, but because the weight of it had finally become real to me. Agnes Whitmore had spent years quietly, carefully setting this up. She'd entrusted it to chance, to whoever happened to pick up a $7 jewelry box at a yard sale and pay close enough attention to notice that the bottom felt wrong. And somehow, that had been me. I didn't take that lightly. Lynette did challenge the codicil. Her attorney argued that Agnes had lacked the mental capacity at the time of writing, that the document was improperly structured as a testamentary instrument, and that the bond was rightfully part of the already settled estate. It wasn't a frivolous argument. Sandra had told me to expect it, but there were several things working against Lynette's position. First, the notary who had witnessed Agnes's signature was still practicing, was easy to locate, and confirmed that Agnes had arrived at her office in November of the previous year, almost 2 years before she passed, presenting herself clearly, asking coherent questions, and expressing specific intent about the document she was signing. The notary, a woman named Roberta Finch, remembered her because Agnes had brought a small photograph of Raymond and set it on the desk while she signed. She said Agnes had told her it was something she needed to do while she still could. While she still could. That phrase stayed with me. Second, a forensic document examiner confirmed that the handwriting in the letter was consistent with other writing samples from Agnes, including cards she'd sent to former students over the years, samples that Fairview Elementary's current principal was kind enough to locate and provide. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the estate sale had not been organized by Lynette at all. It had been organized by a woman named Frances Delacroix, a professional estate sale coordinator who had been hired by the family to clear out Agnes's house after the property was sold. Frances confirmed that she'd priced and tagged everything in the house according to standard procedure. She had no special instructions about the jewelry box. She hadn't known about the compartment. She'd simply tagged it for $7 and put it on the table. Agnes had known that if she left the box in the house, Lynette would find the compartment eventually. But if the box went through an estate sale first, through a professional coordinator who had no loyalty to anyone, there was a real chance it would end up with a stranger with no reason to take it. She'd planned it, carefully, deliberately, over years. Sandra presented all of this, and after a process that I will not pretend was quick or painless, the judge found in favor of upholding the notarized codicil. The savings bond was transferred to me as Agnes Whitmore had directed, $42,000. I want to be honest with you about what happened after, because I think it matters. I didn't keep all of it. I want to be clear that I didn't have to give any of it back. Legally, it was mine. The ruling was clear. But there are things you do because of who you want to be, not because you're required to. I kept enough to cover my legal fees, which had been significant, and a little more. Sandra had worked hard and charged fairly, but it was still a number that made me wince the first time I saw the invoice. The rest, about $31,000, I donated to an organization called the National Center on Elder Justice, which works on exactly the kinds of situations Agnes had described in her letter. I wrote a small note when I sent the donation, explaining that it came from someone who had wanted to make sure something good came from a difficult story. I didn't include Agnes's name. I just said it was in memory of a schoolteacher from Clarksville, Tennessee, who spent 41 years trying to give children the tools they'd need to face the world. I still have the jewelry box. It sits on the shelf in my bedroom now, and sometimes when I pass it, I think about Agnes Whitmore standing in a notary's office with a photograph of Raymond on the desk, signing a document she hoped would find the right person. I think about how much faith that took. Not faith in the legal system, not faith in any particular outcome, just faith that the world might occasionally work the way it's supposed to. The ballerina still doesn't spin. The mechanism is broken beyond what I could fix without replacing it entirely. And somehow I can't bring myself to do that. It feels important to leave some things the way they were found. A few months after everything was settled, I received a letter, a real letter, paper and envelope, from a woman named Dorothy Keene, who had been one of Agnes's former students. She'd heard about the case somehow. I'm not sure how these things travel, but they do. Dorothy wrote that she'd had Mrs. Whitmore in the 4th grade, and that Mrs. Whitmore had been the first adult who ever made her feel like her ideas were worth saying out loud. She wrote that she'd always wanted to thank her and never had, and that she was glad to know Agnes had found a way to make sure the world didn't just take from her at the end. I cried reading that letter. I'm not ashamed of it. I cried because Dorothy Keene was right, and because Agnes Whitmore deserved a lot more than what she got, and because a woman I never met trusted a stranger she couldn't choose with something she'd spent years protecting. I think about that sometimes when I'm at a garage sale, or an estate sale, or anywhere that the collected weight of someone's life is spread out on tables for strangers to pick through. I think about how much of a person's story is invisible, carried in objects, folded into compartments, tucked beneath velvet linings where no one thinks to look. Agnes looked. She planned. And at the end, when she couldn't protect herself any other way, she trusted the world to do it for her. I'm glad I was the one who picked up the box.